All right. I think we can go ahead and kick it off. Yeah, right. That'd be excellent. At least something on that wall back there. It's just very bland and blue, All right. I'm gonna go ahead and kick it off. The first couple, the first slide is boring of me introducing myself anyway. So anybody who hops in later will be able to catch up, no problem. This talk is effective adversary emulation, and it's aimed at small and medium-sized teams. And we'll kind of dive into why that is. And as always, if you have any questions as we're going through this, just dump them into the Q&A, dump them into the chat. I'll be watching it as we go. Who I am? I am Jeremy. Where is that documented mill? I'm on InfoSec Exchange for Mastodon. I'm on GitHub doing stuff and things on occasion. This being VetSec I probably should have put it in here, but I started, my IT career, if you will, as a 2651 in the Marine Corps. So I was doing signals intel. Specifically, I was in comms in the SIGINT community. But then I got out. I was a sysadmin for a while. I was a sysadmin doing responsible for incident response at a university. I was a developer. I moved over to AppSec, right? I did AppSec full time. Then I was doing some IoT pen testing. Then I went over to doing cloud security because I couldn't stand testing another IoT device where we had root in 15, 20 minutes. And then I kind of worked back up to being in charge of an AppSec team and an AppSec or product security team, to now I manage the security team at Bank, right? So I've got that full scope of security systems underneath me again. And what it is that I really like is I like making bad guys frustrated. Hopefully this is what they're looking like whenever they come to try and mess with our bank. Why this talk? Most people don't test at all. When people do test, they tend to suck at it, right? We tend to be really bad at it and ineffective at the way that we do it. And we suck at it because testing resources can be really complicated, right? I'm looking at you, MITRE. And one of the reasons that they're so complicated is because we focus on exact emulation, which is really, really silly. It's really silly because the way that an app detects some other org is not necessarily the same way that they're going to attack yours. Because you have different infrastructure, different stuff, different weaknesses, right? And they don't care about their TTPs. They care about the outcome. The other thing is that we tend to treat tests as pass-fail, right? Which is, that's a pen test, right? Did they get domain admin or did they not get domain admin, for an Active Directory shop? That doesn't really effectively test our program. It is a test of our program. It's a black box test of the program. It's worth doing, but it's not careful, coordinated testing that controls and actually evaluates, right? Or we do the opposite of that. We test individual tools. We poke at just our EDR or just our network defense or just individual pieces. We sometimes can't track the system in its entirety. And why should we test, right? We've got a network security tool or a WAF. We've got zero trust. We've got EDR. We've got SIM and logging. We've got a WIFO tool. I don't know what a WIFO tool is either, but I imagine that one will be advertised sometime in the next 15 or 20 minutes from Palo Alto or someone else. And we need to evaluate how they work together. One of the things that we don't get when we test our tools individually is we don't find out where our blind spots are, what the events that we need to see in the kill chain actually, whether or not we're going to find that event or generate that alert or not. And we also need to reevaluate on some cadence, For me and my team, right, we do that biannually. We have 2 different scopes, and we're going to talk about scoping in a second. And so doing it twice a year makes sense for us. You might only have resources to do it 1 time a year, and that's cool. Doing any number of times is better than doing 0 times. So on some regular cadence, we need to be regularly reevaluating this. We also need to do it because the TTPs are going to change, right? The threats that we face today are not the threats that we're going to face tomorrow, next week, next month, any of the above. So doing this test once, it's not a once and done kind of thing. But like, really, why, right? It's one thing to say all of that, but the truth is that every single time I've done one of these tests, I've been absolutely shocked at the results. Like, really shocked. It's better to find out where you failed right now rather than after you've been ransomware, because if all of your stuff is encrypted, you're never going to find out, right? That's game over. That's the end of the line. You're never going to find out why they were able to do what they were going to do, or you're going to pay a DFIR firm just a ludicrous amount of money to actually tell you where you failed. And that's not how anybody wants to learn any lesson. So hopefully I've convinced you. Well, with my 7-step solution, you too can test. We're going to do it by scoping, examining some TTPs. We're going to design a good test. We're going to weigh the individual steps of our test, and we'll dive into why that's really important. We're going to execute and score the test against those weights. We're going to plan, and we're going to implement. The first step in this process, like, absolutely cannot be overstated, is scoping. Let's look at this incredibly oversimplified continuum of computer systems in an org. And we're actually going to start from right to left. This is some kind of cloud, some kind of company that runs a public service in the cloud, and they've got CI, right? So on from the right to the left, we have customers of some kind hitting cloud, public cloud ingress. Those servers also need to reach outwards. We also have cloud egress. Those services happen to be running on Kubernetes in this example. We've got Kubernetes is running in some kind of cloud provider, AWS, GCP. We've got a CI system. Maybe that's GitHub Actions or Jenkins or whatever it is that we have. We've got some kind of user authentication system. Maybe this is Active Directory. Maybe this is Okta. Maybe this is Authy. It doesn't matter, right? It's whatever it is that happens to be in your org. We've got all of our endpoints. Those developers writing code, and those accountants who are making sure that we get paid, and those HR people who help us hire new people onto our teams. They all got machines, and they're doing stuff on them. So we got those endpoints in there as well. And then we've got some other ingress and egress points into those endpoints, which is, that dirty internet filled with malvertising and whatever else it is that we're going to find these days. And we have email, and maybe there's also an email gateway in here and all that. If we attempted to perform an adversary emulation test that covers this full scope, it's silly. We would never, we'd never finish it. 2, if we did finish it, it's because we went so light on the details that we've essentially made the test useless, right? This is just too big of a scope for us to cover everything. What the better idea is for us to pick and choose based off of our crown jewels, whatever it is that's most important to us that has not been tested recently, and maybe that there's emerging threats for. So maybe that's just looking at your Kubernetes cluster. Maybe we're going to deploy an intentionally vulnerable Kubernetes cluster, and we're going to perform some testing in there. Or, pretending that we have something maybe like a log4j situation, where there's a 0-day out there. Or maybe we're going to look just at that left side of it. Payload delivered via email, run by a user on their endpoint, and then we'll have some form of lateral movement through our authentication system. Or maybe, we can even test somewhere in the middle, right? We can just assume compromise on endpoint, and we're going to test just up to our CI system and touch into that Kubernetes. What does it look like if there's a compromised developer machine? Scoping is really, really important. Too big is a problem. Too small is also a problem, or we're not going to get a huge amount of value out of the test. And this is where the art of doing this and gaining experience from it is really important. So decide on what you're going to test, and more importantly, what it is that you're not, what you're going to leave out, and drive your decisions based off of your crown jewels. And hopefully you have a crown jewels analysis. You know where your most sensitive things are. You know what it is that an attacker is going to go after in your company, and base your initial testing off of that. The next thing we do is we're going to start examining attacker TTPs. We have to decide what type of hacker we are. Maybe we're, the very stereotypical black hat hacker, right? The North Koreas of the world. Maybe I can only assume that this dude is the guy who just hacked MGM. Right? I don't know why he's standing next to a giant billboard, but he seems very hackery. Or, maybe we're worried about the government, and I can only assume this is a very well-funded Silicon Valley type hacker, right? Somebody maybe this is a disgruntled employee who's just been let go because they wouldn't let him buy a fourth monitor. We don't know. The choice of what TTPs we're going to use are the results of our scope. We're going to pick TTPs for the things that we're testing. If we're looking at a log4j style attack, we're going to go look at what the threat actors who tried to exploit log4j are using for that public cloud infrastructure type thing. If we're looking at our email situation, we're going to look at what threat actors are sending stuff via email, what it is that what kind of payloads they're sending, and how they're moving laterally, and what kind of businesses they're targeting. Again, this is also going to be driven by our crown jewels. I keep hitting that because it's really important, and a lot of times we miss the forest for the trees when we're doing these tests. And you want to keep this really high level for now. This is a step in the process, but this is really a continuous one. For me, I lurk in various threat intel channels. If you're here from the VetSec Slack, I'm regularly posting in the cyber threat intel channel with stuff that I see. The Bloodhound Gang Red Team channel is a great example of what some of the pen testers are doing, or at least people who are better at it than I am. And I've got a notebook where I'm constantly just filling these out. And then when it comes time to design a test, I'm picking and choosing bits and pieces off of those notes that I found and off of those after action reports from the Mandiants and the Secure Workses of the world. The next step is to design. We're going to take our scope, we're going to take our TTP, and this is where we actually decide what it is that we're going to do as part of our test. And one of the things that we really want to make sure, or one of the most useful tools that we can use in this process, is to use MITRE ATT&CK. I imagine most of you are familiar, but MITRE ATT&CK breaks it down very nicely, and we can kind of pick and choose from our columns in the MITRE ATT&CK matrix in order to design what our attack chain looks like and break it down into steps like that. But it's really important as we design our test. We have to be able to execute it, right? We have to actually be able to do the thing, because the very next step that we're about to do is or 2 steps from now, is to do it. We have to be able to acquire or build it, which means that you can't say I'm going to use Cobalt Strike if you're not willing to go pirate it or buy a copy. You're going to have to look at a different C2. And this step includes the building and or acquiring of it. So if you're going to say that you're going to use some custom home-rolled shellcode to pull off your attack scenario because you really want to drive home the point on needing a new EDR, this step includes going and actually doing that part of the process. A lot of the times you don't have to do that, and we'll kind of cover that at the end when we talk about some suggestions for the first time that you do your test. but you should know that this step is where that occurs. An example test. This is loosely based off one that I performed fairly recently. A developer with local admin downloads a backdoored npm package. That package is going to download a stager. That stager is going to persist with a scheduled task. We're assuming Windows here, but this could also be a cron if we're talking on Mac OS or Linux box. That stager is going to download some sliver shellcode. We're going to escalate with a bring your own vulnerable driver. There's a missing V in there, I noticed right now, despite having given this talk more than once. And then we're going to steal an Okta token, and then we're going to log into the cloud provider. What you notice here is that logging into the cloud provider proves that we could move laterally from one system into another. We can change scope, but we're not going to actually go and test what's happening in AWS. We're going to just prove that we could, and that's where we're going to end our test. That's where we've drawn our artificial line for our scope. It's really good to draw yourself some nice pictures as you do this. It's also really good before you perform the test to make sure that you communicate to your other key stakeholders. I say that as somebody who has been blindsided by people running tests and not telling them that they're doing it, causing a full-scale incident response that they did not intend to create, and as someone who has accidentally run tests without communicating them effectively before. Both are bad on both sides of it. Don't do that. So build yourself some nice diagrams and communicate with your other stakeholders that you're about to do one of these. So in this case, right, we can see that we have our user downloading the backdoor package from GitHub. We have them downloading a stager, creating C2 comms over to a separate server, which is our C2 server. We have the attacker running C2 commands, performing, some discovery on that host. We have the and stealing that Okta cookie. We have our Okta using the stolen Okta credentials, and then moving laterally into AWS before we close the test. Also, always nice to break it down and just into a nice flowchart. Overly document everything. It has literally never hurt anybody to make sure it's written down and communicated. The next step is to weigh. Weighing is important because not every step is as important. Not everything that can be detected or alerted on is as important as the others. New scheduled tasks, as I'm sure if you're on the blue team, get created all the time, right? They're everywhere. So you're just not going to weigh those events nearly as heavily as you are the fact that Sliver is running and performing C2 commands. That's vastly more important to us. And as we do the test, we should treat them as separately. So what we're going to do is we're going to break our test design into detections by tool. So we're going to, at a minimum, have a detection or alert and a tool tuple for every one of those, right? Because we might want to see the event or alert out of both the EDR and our network security tool. So we're going to put them in both places. And then we're going to assign it a weight. I tend to use a 1 to 10 scale, with 1 being the least important and 10 being the most important. But this is inherently a subjective scoring as we go through it with how important you and your team thinks that these various things are. So I suggest starting with 1 through 10 because I think I've got a pretty good system, but you can adjust it to whatever works for you. And why we're going to do this? It's because it's going to drive our prioritization for implementing our fixes, because we're going to know what the most important failures were and what performed significantly worse than we need or expected it to. So we're going to touch on this a little bit, but like at the most basic, it's just the overall weight. If you are getting better and maybe you're a little bit more mature of an organization and you want to start getting advanced, you might have it broken down a little bit more, where you'll have something like your EDR detected end event, the EDR alerted on the event, and the EDR automatically took action on the event in our step. And all those can be broken down into various steps and weighed accordingly. And yeah, Rob, you're absolutely correct. Not everything can be critical. It's just not possible. So you want to make sure that you're treating the really important stuff as really important, and everything else we're treating, you know, as not important as it is, for lack of a better way. So this is an example. Obviously, stripped a whole bunch of stuff out of here, but we're saying that the dev downloading the APM, the npm package, it's got a weight of 2. It's just not that important. But we definitely want to see that what package it was that started this whole thing. So the EDR indicating what npm package is installed, a little bit more important. The stager executing, being able to detect that, is much, much more important. And an attacker using Okta cookies from some alternate location via an impossible travel, right? All of a sudden they went from Austin, Texas to Hong Kong, and they're logging into AWS. We better find that one, because if that happens, something has gone terribly wrong, and we know that our team should be looking at it. The next step for this one is to execute and score it. To me, this is the fun part, right? This is time to go take off my white hat, put on a hat of a slightly darker shade of gray, and get to go play with some offensive security tools, which is great when you're mostly focused on the blue side of the house. As we perform our test, for each step from the previous one, from where we weighed, we evaluate a score. The score is somewhere between 0 and its weight. So if the weight is a 10, it can get a score anything from 0, we absolutely missed it, it doesn't exist anywhere, you know, it's things performed terribly, all the way up to a 10, which is it logged it, it prevented it, it did everything that we wanted our tool to do. It's also in anything in between, right? Maybe we wanted it to block and alert, but all we got was just a log event. Like, we can find it, but it didn't really do what it is that we were expecting it to do. Maybe it only gets a 1 out of a 6. It's inherently subjective and up for debate among your team. And this is really important. As you execute this, you want to be able to intentionally bypass your successes. I know that sounds weird, right? But if there's a break in that exploit chain, we don't want the test to be over. That would be a test of a single tool if we detected it at the network level, right? We detected our stager download and we immediately block it. And we just go, cool, our network security works, test over. That's not effective. We don't want to do that. We want to give our network security tool full marks, or our EDR full marks, but then we want to intentionally allow it so we can continue through the next phases of the test. And then the other thing we want to do is we want to make sure that this is repeatable, because we're going to go take actions based off of this test. So we want to make sure that we can come back and perform the test again. And we want to be performing the same test that we documented really well during our previous steps. So we're only going to allow minor deviations. If we're using some obfuscation for our payload just to make sure, right, to get past the network security tool and emulate what the attackers are doing, and we're going to change it from ROT 13 to, you know, an XOR with, you know, some key in an HTTP header or something like that, cool. Like, go for it, document that you made that change, and move on. But if we're going to entirely change our you know, C2 framework, probably not. That's not going to really, that's too much for the purpose of a single test. After we've executed it, unfortunately, right, the really fun parts of this are done, at least for me. But the part that gets us paid and the reason that companies give us jobs starts from there. If we don't do anything with steps 1 through 5, this is literally useless. This was not worth the time. We did not provide any value to the people who pay us. unless we're just writing a report and giving it to them. But then we're probably a pen test company offering this as some other service. And at least for me, that's not what I do, right? That's not adversary emulation. That's pen testing as a service of some kind. What we're going to do is we're going to prioritize the weight score deltas. We're going to take our scores, we're going to take our weights, we're going to subtract the scores from it, and then we're going to rank what those deltas are. The higher the delta, the more important it is for us to fix. We're going to want to do our root cause analysis. We're going to find out why the tool failed. Was it not actually, was it a macOS endpoint and we didn't actually have full disk access on? And so Carbon Black reported that a device is healthy, but it couldn't actually see any devices on any events on the hard drive. Maybe that's a real failure that I've seen during a test before. We're also going to want to evaluate in this step what should be done to make it not fail again. And then we're going to want to take that and we're going to want to put all of those failures and those root cause analyses and those actions for how to fix them into tickets. If we're feeling fancy, we might even put them into an epic if we're using Jira. But the point is we're going to correctly prioritize them, put them on our backlog, and then make sure that we actually go and, oh, sorry, this is an example, but we're going to want to make sure we actually pick up those tickets and do something with them. So this is an example of our deltas. So in this case, dev downloaded the NPM. It did perfect. We did everything we wanted to do. It's got a 0. Our EDR, this had a weight of 4. We only barely found it. And this is an example of one of those ones where maybe we expected our EDR to alert on this because it's not a normal one, or it's somebody installing an NPM package directly from NPM and not from Artifactory or something like that. And we have some rules based on that. So our delta here is a 3. That's still a low, or but it's not crazy. For the stager executing, boy, it failed super bad. It didn't have the highest score. We found it a little bit, but it didn't do any of the things that we were really expecting it to do. We got a 7. That's going to be a moderate. And then we didn't detect, we found the log event, but Okta didn't block that impossible travel alert. We didn't get an alert out of Okta. It didn't automatically lock them the way we wanted it to. We've got a delta of 9 there. That's our most critical thing for us to immediately go and fix. And we can treat it as critical as it is. And then the last thing is implement. Tickets by themselves mean nothing, right? I know I keep hitting on this, but I've seen people's backlogs as I've gone to talk to them before. You have to pick them up. You have to fix them. And you have to actually test that you fixed them, which is why we only allowed minor deviations from our previous test, so that we can effectively spin this up and perform the test again. And then we're going to go do it again. We're going to look at what we tested last time. We're going to look at what the new priority is. We're going to see what the new threat surface is. Maybe we want to emulate, move it next time. So we're going to be looking at our cloud ingress versus last time. We were really worried about malvertising, and that's why we tested our other side of things. Your first test. Let's say I've convinced you this seems like a really great idea. This is a thing that you want to go and do. If I was going to give you some advice for running your first one, or bringing this to somebody to let them convince you to do your first one, is to start small, like really small, like way smaller than you think you have to test, because it's really, really easy to overestimate, especially as you read one of these blogs about somebody who got, ransomwared and all of the ways that they moved laterally and everything else like that. That's cool. You'll get there probably, right, if your org is continuing to mature. But your first one, start really small. Also, don't get too fancy. Process hollowing, module stomping, dynamic call stacks, all that stuff is fantastically cool, and I love writing it. I love playing with it. I love doing everything involved with it. But you probably don't need it. The basics will get you really, really far. And what I mean by the basics are like netcat, reverse SSH, sliver with just the base obfuscation, Python reverse shells generated by revshells.com, Metasploit, the really basic things that have been in use forever will take you way farther than you think they're going to. So a good first test is, email with a link to an executable. A simulated user downloads it, execute it, it persists, and it steals some files. This would be a bad day depending on who that user is who downloaded an executable and ran it by itself. So it's a test that's worth doing, especially if you pretend to be that user or communicate that type of scenario to your management and let them, give you the time to do this test. And you'll genuinely be really amazed at how far it can, how much it can tell you about the effectiveness of all of your security tools. Resourcing. It'd be unfair for me to tell you that you should go and do this without giving you some idea of how many resources, how much time it takes to do. I use mostly open source tools. Collection of those tools takes roughly 3 to 6 hours. Again, lurking in various channels and asking friends of mine who also do this is really useful, right? I got a bunch of that knowledge just kind of kicking around the back of my head. I also wrote some tools myself. This is not required. This is just, Jeremy playing and learning. If you're interested, I wrote a stager in Rust that there's a link to. You can also see the sample backdoor Python library. I basically just forked Arrow and added some malicious pre-install steps to the package. The infrastructure setup, the first time it took me about 6 hours. The second time, if I was going to go kick up the infrastructure to run this test, I could do it in under an hour. I have most of it automated now, which is really handy, especially Sliver is very easy to install. They did a really great job of making it easy to install. I recommend it as a first C2 if you don't have one that you already pay for. The test itself, once I have a good effective design, I've got all of my tools, I've done all of that pre-work. One engineer can execute this in about 5 hours. If I have other engineers from my team coming in to help me with the test, it's going to take longer. It is not going to be shorter, but it is worth doing because one of the things that you should be doing as a mentor is teaching the other people on your team and training them, which is why it adds time, but that also adds value. That's absolutely worth doing, and it's what you should do and trying to avoid running this in a silo. Resources, the actual recommendation is always comes from step 2, which is the TTPs. It's whatever the bad guys are using. If they're using, whatever the new cool C2 is that comes out and you can get your hands on it, that's what you should be using. If you need something that's off the shelf, Sliver and Covenant have both been really good choices for me. Bring your own vulnerable drivers. There's lulldrivers.io, which is a handy test. That's one of the things bad guys love doing at the moment, apparently. AppleScript phishing is also really useful. I have found that a highly effective method is if you first get execution on a box, look up whatever remote management tool they're doing, and then you can pretty easily generate some AppleScript that looks like it and be like, hey, we need to update, please give me your password, and ta-da, you're an admin. Cursed Chrome and Cursed Edge, actually, I should add, I wrote a blog post on this. Cursed is awesome. It is a very cool post-exploitation tool, and you should check it out, especially if you are relying on GeoIP detections. You maybe shouldn't anymore. It is pretty cool way to act on behalf of a user. I also have some detections on how to detect it in your environment. And then persistence, again, also whatever the bad guys are doing, the basics will take you far. A lot of times they're not doing anything really incredibly fancy. And that's all I got. That's how I go ahead. That's how I do adversary emulation for teams that I've managed. I think it is a much more scalable approach to testing. I also think that building in prioritization is really important in the design step to make sure that you are prepared to rapidly turn this around into actions, reducing that what essentially is a time of detection to time of response and time of fix. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the QA, or I'm not sure how this part of things works. Unmute and ask, or whatever it is you'd like. Yeah, so there's a question here from Rob, right? Which misconfigurations do you see the most often that I take advantage of? It's a good question. I think reliance on network security tools is the most often. Blocking based on signature and based on unknown URLs or something, or fresh domains is, it feels like a really safe space. It's been around for a hot minute. People have been trying to do it forever. What I see more and more is that, the payloads are coming from GitHub and the orgs are GitHub users. And so that means nothing anymore. Or we're seeing people using CloudFront to front their C2 frameworks, and then it looks like a CloudFront URL as opposed to the C2 URL. And what are you going to do? You're going to go block all of CloudFront? That's not going to do it for you. The other thing is that you just expect your EDR to perform better than it does. And I think it's really important. That really highlights for me just how important it is to evaluate the effectiveness of all of your tools together, so you can detect when your EDR fails. Like maybe it's generating events that are going to be important later, but they're not generating alerts or blocks, that you can detect malicious actions in other places, so that you have that defense in depth, that overlapping security. Kevin asked how to get past management, or how I've gotten management and convince them the tools are okay when there's an anti-open source sentiment. That's a good question. I think that's where it's useful to a lot of times point at one way, if you do have the ability to develop them yourself, right? That's always super handy, right? Like, this can't be malicious. I wrote it. You paid me to write it. Yay, that's awesome. In the other cases, I think, for example, Sliver is a really good example. Sliver is released by Bishop Fox, who is a very well-known and reputable company. So trying to lean on the tools released by some of the larger pen testing providers, if there's a really hesitancy around using some of the tools, is useful. It can also be useful to, especially for your first ones, as you kind of start dipping your toes into it, really isolate some of these boxes. So deploy them in the exact same way that you would, at least, with what profile from your EDR and everything else gets installed, but run them in a isolated network segment to help provide compensating controls, even in the case that something goes wrong, can be a good way for you to give people the warm and fuzzies. That's an awesome. AJ asked about CRTO courses and certs. I got to be honest. I am maybe the world's worst person to ask about classes and certs. I have none. I came very close to getting a couple, but I have none, and I have never had the opportunity to do any of the SANS courses. They might be fantastic. They might even do a better job of this than I do in explaining it, but I don't have any experience there, unfortunately. And yeah, Kevin, absolutely. I'm living in sin on the Slack channel. Also, I dropped my contact info in the slides. The link is up at the top of the chat. I'm also just not hard to find on the internet. If you have questions, feel free to reach out anytime. Scott, that's an excellent question. Besides the presentation, I owe writing this up in a longer form text and providing some of the templates around what the tables, the weighing, and things like that look like. It is mostly written. I plan on releasing it in the next week or two. I'll probably drop it into the VetSec Slack when I do. It'll also be on my dev.to page, and I dropped the link to, did I? Nope, I think I meant to. This is the Cursed Chrome blog that I said I was leaving. That's also where I release all of my blogs. So that's where it'll be once it goes up. And that looks super cool, Douglas. He dropped a link to threat hunting DLL injected C2 implants. That's cool stuff. Awesome, everyone. Well, I really appreciate the time. I appreciate you coming out and listening to me talk. Again, if you do have any other questions or things that you want to just talk about, even I'm on the VetSec Slack. I'm on Mastodon. I'm on a bunch of places. Feel free to hit me up anytime. And I really appreciate y'all taking the time today. Thank you.